Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this video I want to talk about the books that I've read recently. There are 5 books to talk about, so let's just dive right in. The first is a book that I received as an ebook from Books Sirens. They're kind of like NetGalley, where you can receive advanced reader copies for review. And the very first book I received from Books Sirens was The Opening Night Murders by James Scott Byrnside. And this book actually came out in 2019, so it's not an advanced copy, but I still received the copy for review. And so I'm going to put a picture of the cover up here. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. This book is set in Chicago in 1935, and it's a mystery. So right away I was hooked. I love historical mysteries, and the 30s are a really interesting time period. So this book is set in Chicago in 1935, and the main character is a private detective called Rowan Mannery, and his partner is Walter Williams. I've just got my notes here, so when I'm looking down, that's what I'm doing. Now, these two have their work cut out for them when Lisa Pluvian shows them the death threat that she has received, which basically says that she will die on the opening night of her play. She is acting in a play that was written and directed by her sister, and so she goes to them with this death threat. Fast forward to the opening night of the play, and Lisa falls to her death from the set balcony in front of 200 theater goers. So it's also a bit of an impossible crime because the police haven't found any reason why she fell. There was nothing wrong with the railing on the balcony. There was no alcohol or poison or drugs in her bloodstream. Obviously there was nobody close enough to her to push her. So how did she fall to her death? It must have been an accident. And so of course the private detectives are looking into it. They feel some responsibility here. This also, I think, even more than a locked room or an impossible crime, it was a really fun pastiche of the classic hard-boiled mystery. It had all of the elements. It had the private detective. It was set in the 30s. It had witty dialogue, and yes, there was some violence and language. There wasn't any sex, but there was a little bit of maybe in conversation. But all told, it really did feel like that classic hard-boiled murder mystery. How was she killed? Why was she killed? And before the story is over, there are more bodies. And the second murder, unlike the first, is obviously murder, and it was definitely more bloody than the first one. And it was also, that second murder was also that great classic, I have proof and I'm gonna take it to the detectives in the morning situation, and then that person gets killed. You know, whenever that happens, you know that that person's gonna get killed, right? Yeah. But I really enjoyed this. I thought it had a complex plot. The clues were cleverly hidden throughout the story. I did not guess the killer, and I usually do. I read a lot of mysteries, and I often guess the killer, but I didn't in this case. It had good pacing, and I really liked the dialogue. Here's an example. The detective, Rowan, says, "I am verbose." And Lisa says, "You talk a lot too." Which I loved. So yeah, I really enjoyed that book, and so thank you to Books Sirens and the publishers for sending me a copy for review. Then I read They Found Him Dead by Georgette. This was the book that how do I say this? In a recent video, I played a game. It was Game My Library, The Scavenger Hunt. I did a scavenger hunt in order to find my next read, and it was this book. So this book, They Found Him Dead, is one of Georgette Heyer's mysteries, and it was published, in 1961. So In this book, it's set in a kind of a country manor house. I would totally call this a country manor house mystery. If that's your style of mystery, if you really enjoy that, this could be the book for you. So the family in this book is the Kane family, and the story opens with Silas Kane's 60th birthday party. And so there's a number of people gathered. The family is there, plus some friends. Silas, his business partners are there, the Mansells. And then Silas ends up walking off a cliff that night. He goes for a walk every night, but the next day he is found at the bottom of the cliff. Now, the police and the coroner don't think there's any funny business. They think that it's just an accident. And then his nephew, I believe that it's his nephew, what was his name now? 1 second. I should have done this. I should have done some looking ahead of time, right? Yeah, I should have. Clement is the heir apparent, and he and his odious wife move into the house. Silas's mother still lives there, and she has a companion, and there are great nephews and various other people at the house. Well, Clement moves into the house right away, takes over the business, and then Clement is shot in the study. And that one is definitely a murder, and so then the police arrive to investigate. I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars, and I've just noticed from my notes that this version was published in 61, but this story was actually originally published in 1937. So it's very much a golden age mystery, which I really enjoy. It's definitely a manor house mystery, country manor house mystery, where you've got like a group of family and business partners, and murder ensues. And so, yeah, I can really recommend They Found Him Dead. It was a really enjoyable read. And then I read Sense and Sensibility by Joanna Trollope. So this is part of the project where the publishers have asked certain authors to write each of the major 6 Jane Austen books as a modern retelling. And so Joanna Trollope did Sense and Sensibility. And I did not like it. I gave it 2 stars, but I probably really could give it 1 star. I don't know, I can't, it's like I can't bring myself to give a book 1 star. But I did not like it at all. I just think it did not work to take this story and tell it in a modern setting. And I think if Joanna Trollope had taken the characters and the overarching plot and then retold it in a modern setting, it may have worked. But she tried to tell this story like point by point, plot point by plot point, and it just didn't work in the modern setting. I know Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures, she made this comment too, that it just didn't work to try and transfer it into a modern day setting. And so, for example, that discussion that Eleanor and Marianne have after Marianne and Willoughby go to visit his house, and that's maybe inappropriate, and that whole discussion. Well, in this book, and I guess this is a spoiler, so fast forward a few seconds if you don't want any spoilers. But in this book, Marianne does go with Willoughby to the house where they have sex. And Eleanor, in the argument afterwards, Eleanor was like, I don't care that you had sex there. What bothers me is that you were sneaky about it. I was just like, what? She was sneaky and that's why you're so upset? Like, it was a big argument. So, I mean, it just didn't work. And so, yeah, so I just didn't really enjoy this at all. I also didn't really like kind of what she did with the characters. Like Eleanor wasn't really a very likable character, and there were times when she was actually kind of violent, which was a bit surprising. However, I did like Colonel Brandon, which I guess is not a huge surprise, but I really liked Colonel Brandon, and I actually really liked Mr. Palmer. I like what she did with Mr. Palmer in this book, so that was entertaining. But one good thing from reading this book is that it drove me to pick up Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and so I'm reading this now. I'm still in volume 1, but I am loving it and realizing this doesn't need a modern retelling. The story in itself is just fine. And this Dover Thrift edition that I have has an interesting foreword note at the beginning, and the person who wrote this note at the beginning makes a really interesting comment. Most people would say, I think, when they hear of the story of Sense and Sensibility, that it's a story of extremes, you know, the extremes of sense in Eleanor and sensibility in Marianne. But he says it's actually a story of moderation. Let's see, here he says, though its title suggests a pairing of opposites, Eleanor Dashwood represents sense, reason, and discretion, while her sister Marianne represents sensibility, passion, and spontaneity. The book is really about moderation. By the novel's end, Eleanor and Marianne are brought to the stable middle ground represented by matrimony. Eleanor must acknowledge the depth of her feelings for Edward Ferrars, and Marianne must overcome her passion for Willoughby. I thought that was a really interesting thought, and I'm going to keep that in mind as I read this book. So, I guess the one good thing from my disappointing experience with this book is that it drove me to read this one again, and I'm super excited to be doing that. And then I read The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie by Alan Bradley. I've had this book here in my library for a little while, and I'm not sure what it was that drove me to pick it up, but I decided to give it a whirl. Alan Bradley is a Canadian author, actually, but this is a historical mystery set in 1950 in England. And one of the kind of unique aspects about this series is the main character, the narrator, not the narrator, I guess, but the main character is Flavia de Luce, and she's 11 years old in this book. Now, I know there's a number of books in this series, and she does grow up, but in this first book, she's 11. And so I had a little bit of trepidation going into this, because I wasn't entirely sure how much I would like a story that's kind of told from her, it's told at least from her perspective. She's the main, oh yes, it is told from her perspective. And so I thought, I don't know about the child narrator, but she was delightful. She was precocious. Her passion in life is chemistry. She loves chemistry. And so she's a smart little cookie. But I also felt, on the other hand, that her actions and her behavior really did suit an 11-year-old. Granted, she's a very intelligent 11-year-old who may have slightly different interests than a lot of other ones, but it is 1950. But it did really go into great detail of her relationship with her sisters. There was great sibling rivalry going on there. And she did behave in all manners as an 11-year-old would, I think. So I didn't have a problem with the child narrator. So in The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie, her father is I'm going to get this word wrong, he collects stamps, a philatelist, something like that. Anyways, and one day a bird, they find a bird on their doorstep with a stamp stuck in its beak, and it's a special stamp. It's a penny black, I think they're called. And her father is freaking out, but doesn't say kind of what the problem is. And then the next day, Flavia finds a man dead in the cucumber patch. And the story goes on from there. So I really did enjoy this one, and I would definitely pick up the next in the series if I see it at the library or, you know, at a book sale or something. And then I read A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, I think. Now, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I didn't really like this book. I thought that I would. It's set in Russia and it takes place between the 20s and the 50s, which is an intriguing time period in Russian history. I really enjoy Russian history, and there's so much about this that was interesting. So the main character in this book is Count Rostov, and at the very beginning, he of course is an aristocrat, but after the revolution, etc., he is deemed a former person and is put under house arrest at a hotel. And so he is told that if he ever leaves that hotel, he will be killed. He'll be shot on sight, essentially. And so he has to live the rest of his life in this hotel, and he observes all of these major events taking place kind of from the hotel. So all of that sounded really, really good. But I had some major problems with how this book was written, how this story was told. First of all, pacing. The author could not decide how to pace this book, and it drove me crazy. The first two books, it's set in books. There's like 4 or 5 books in here. The first two are really slow, and I actually almost DNF'd this book. I was like, I can't handle it. It's too slow. Nothing's happening. But then I was encouraged to continue, that it does get better. And this is the thing that completely baffled me, is it does. The minute you start reading book 3, the pace picks up. And I don't understand that. Like, why were the first 2 books so slow, and then suddenly the pace picks up and it becomes, you know, kind of more faster paced, evenly paced in books 3, 4, and 5. I didn't understand that at all. And my husband made a good point. He said, excuse me, I dropped my paper there. He said that he doesn't have a problem with uneven pacing if there's a literary reason for it, and I would totally agree with that, but I just couldn't find the literary reason for it. So that drove me crazy. The other thing that I couldn't understand was the use of footnotes. Footnotes are not very common in a novel, and in this case I thought, well, if they're just to kind of make a special note about certain things that a modern day reader who is not from Russia might need to know, then that would be fine. But they weren't. Some of them were. So there was one footnote about the secret police and the various name changes through the years. And so that was helpful information. But other footnotes were more about, oh, here's what happens to this one character that only appears in this one scene and is never again in the book, but I need to tell you in a page and a half of footnotes what happens to this character. So I didn't understand the purpose of the footnotes. And then my third problem that I had with how this story was told was that the author couldn't figure out the narration. So the majority of the book is third person omniscient, which is totally fine. I don't have a problem with that. That's great. But then every once in a while, for no reason I could understand, it would change to second person. So I, you, us. So it was like, for some reason, the author felt like he needed to drop us more closely into the story, but I couldn't understand why. So for example, on page 54, I made notes here. I kept track of every time it went into the second person because I was trying to figure out why he did that. So on page 54, he says, then with a certain dizziness, the Count realized that they were headed towards his old suite. But wait, we are ahead of ourselves. And then that one sentence, and then it just goes back into third person. And then the time that I most noticed it, I think, because it was a little bit jarring, is at the end of one paragraph, there is a, the paragraph. The very next paragraph, it's those exact words again at the top of the page in italics, and then it says, "What's this? When we last left this pair in 1923, did not Anna Urbanova dismiss the Count? And, so what possibly could have happened to reunite these contrary souls? Well, when we first encountered Miss Urbanova," and then that lasts for maybe another paragraph, and then it goes back into third person. So I just couldn't understand the purpose of it. He does it sometimes in footnotes as well. Sometimes this second person will appear in the footnotes. And then, completely out of the blue, on page 430, all of a sudden, the narrator isn't omniscient anymore. So, you know, what went through the mind of the bishop as he descended the 5 flights from the attic to the ground floor? What emotion did he feel? Perhaps, or maybe. And I thought, why all of a sudden is he not omniscient anymore? I don't get it. And then he just goes right back into being third person omniscient. So yeah, that I just didn't understand. And so I know that this is an unpopular opinion, but not every book is for every reader, and I just think this book and I just didn't get along. I did enjoy the characters. I felt like we could have gotten maybe a little more about the characters, and the overall story I did like, but the other things bothered me enough to really like reduce my enjoyment of this book. So, have you read any of these books? What were your thoughts? And especially about the Gentleman in Moscow. I'd love to talk with you in the comments below. What were your thoughts about that book? If you loved it, let me know why. I would really like to have that discussion. So if you've read any of these, let's talk about it down in the comments below. And I will see you for another video soon. Bye.